Good afternoon, members of GGwow. I am Tettles, joined by Dratnos and Theun, and we are here to bring tier list content, the most informative and the best of our time.
This is our Wowhead tier list, so if you want to go check it out on Wowhead, we'll have a link in the description where you can go see it there. There it will be updated as well as we learn things and as balance changes come in.
Today we're going to be talking about the Raid Healer Tier list and just talking about things that the healers do well in progression, reasons to play these specs, reasons to maybe not play some of these specs, and then why Resto Shaman deserves a buff. Some of the criteria, obviously, it really depends between like healers, tanks, and DPS for Raid. For healers, there's such a lot of factors at play. I think one of the biggest things is like throughput HPS though, right, Theun?
Yeah, I think like after this last tier, we kind of saw they shifted a little bit away from just always having DR healers be like the best. So hopefully that continues going forward.
Obviously, damage is also incredibly important. I mean, we're going to talk about like passive damage versus active damage from these healers as well. I do think that in general, though, all of the healers are fairly close right now before you even start ranking stuff.
Yeah, I think like it's really hard to separate. I don't know exactly how you have them laid out right now, but like the A tier in like my mind is like stacked. So
yes,
it's really hard to separate a lot of them.
Okay, I will start us off with what we have in the A tier. So basically how it went down was S tier is like 2 copies are more likely than 0. A tier is a great choice. We expect 1 copy of these healers in basically all fights. B is like a solid spec that can provide enough useful things to be considered on most encounters. And then C tier is like something that, you know, it's a spec that probably needs a little bit more help to be brought, but it can be brought if given really good circumstances. So starting off in the A tier with Holy Paladin. I think this is a surprise to absolutely nobody. Holy Paladin is up here.
Yeah, if anything, it's like, is this S or is this A, right? Like, because I think the 1 copy of Holy Paladin is extremely likely from top end teams, right? You're looking at the Paladin utility that is potentially not forthcoming from your DPS or your tanks, right? So you've got a Devotion Aura that maybe is just coming from your healer, which is huge on its own. But even then, you've got a spec that's just doing a ton of healing, right?
They're not really like the DPS powerhouse that they were in like BFA and Shadowlands, but like they still do really, really good throughput. And like the throughput that they bring is like unique. Like they're really heavy spot healers with like Holy Shock and stuff. And they can also play like Marauders as well if they want to. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're quite the powerhouse that they were in BFA and Shadowlands, just because like some of the other healers are like passing them in the damage department, but they still have like all of the really good power utility. And like I don't think you're going to see a raid without a Holy Paladin at the top end. So
correct me if I'm wrong, but Aura Mastery plus Devo Aura, obviously incredibly strong. In addition to that, they have high uptime on wings with Zealot, with the Mad Paragon Legendary Zealot's Paragon talent now. And on top of that, they are the best tank healer. Like realistically, if you needed a large amount of tank healing for whatever reason, not that tanks didn't really need that much healing right now, but if you
we don't know, right? Like the tank damage, tank self-sustain it depends on which tank specs you're bringing and how hard the raid bosses are hitting. But after that 40% damage and health change, it is possibly a niche that's valuable. Yeah.
Especially if you have a Brewmaster, because those things aren't very tanky. You probably want a Holy Paladin.
I mean, you could even board the second one, depending on how much tank damage there are, right?
Yeah, the one downside I think they have currently with their like optimal playstyle is I think they're hard casting like Holy Light into their beacon targets, which has not been a thing for a long time. So it's like a lot of healing just on like a few targets. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's like, I think you could still maybe make the argument for like running 2 of them if you wanted to.
What's the deal with like spread healing? Because there are actually a decent number of fights that require you to be fairly strong at spread healing.
They have like their lighted on is now 40 yards, or they have a option for that in their talent tree, so that helps them a bunch. They still have like Rule of Law to like help them. I mean, they have the largest effective range out of any healer because of that, so they still do quite well in spread healing, and like they aren't as hindered if they have to leave melee ever. So like if there's like a Fetid Devourer, they're not like completely useless if they have to walk away. So I think they're like overall like kit wise, I think they're probably a little bit better off. They're just not doing as much damage as they used to.
It's ridiculous that they didn't gain much and they're still in A.
Yep.
Okay. All right, our next spec up here is the Discipline Priest, which one nice value about this is that you are doing quite a bit of passive damage as part of your healing rotation. That's kind of one of the core strengths of Disc Priest, besides also being another DR raid cooldown through barrier. The Holy Paladin Disc Priest at the top of the raid tier list has been something that you'll recognize from the past 7 years of World of Warcraft, most tiers this has kind of been true. Last year was kind of an exception, even from them being as good as they've usually been. But we're tiering Disc back up in A once again. Theun, how do you feel like it's kind of developed into Dragonflight?
They gained a lot of cool tools, which is nice. They lost a couple of cool utility things like their knockback and stuff. Now Shaman has something. I don't know why they don't have a kick. Notably, is like the only healer without a kick. So that's a downside, I guess.
Doesn't really matter in raid, though, right? You've got a bunch of other people who could have kicks. Although, if you ever do need to talent a kick for a fight, I guarantee you that every time you pull that boss the first time each week, you will miss a kick because somebody doesn't have it talented.
Why doesn't the healer have kick, bro?
Yeah.
They still have PI, which is really, really strong. And they even have like the Twins legendary with it, like always. So they even get a benefit from it now. Their ramp is even better than it was in Shadowlands because they now have like even more tools for it. Like Light's Wrath is back. So they're really good at what they're used to like being good at. And they gained even more damage. So I think this priest is really good. The one downside is like they're currently really struggling on mana, which isn't like an abnormal thing for Disc Priest, but like you really, really want at least one Innervate or some form of like external mana, like the Preservation or like the Evoker thing that gives you mana back. Like you need something on a Disc Priest or you are very sad.
What's stopping them from seeing 2 copies?
I think it's like honestly mana.
Okay.
I don't know how often you're going to be able to run like 4 Boomkins, for example, or like 4 Druids in your comp. I think you could like still make the argument of running double disc, but if you are limited on like mana options, it's really gonna hurt you. So, but they still, I mean, their ramps are really good, which is like notably really good for like really bursty raid patterns, which are still present, unfortunately.
I mean, it makes it almost even more important, right? Because of after the 40% health and creature damage change, it seems like some stuff got a little bit more smooth with how you're taking damage, but Disc is probably the best burst healer as it currently stands. And so, I mean, it's good. Their ramps are sick.
Yeah, if you can play Disc, I think you're still locked in Disc prison. So,
well, I mean, also there's also like a raid buff thing. Fortitude is, I mean, you're going to want to run one healer priest, I think, in some capacity, and this is the easiest way, at least in my opinion, to get Fortitude.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it is a strength of healing priest as well, that the same gear on the same character lets you play Holy and Disc depending on the fight as well, which is another notable benefit to gearing priests this season.
I would say it's more of a benefit to Holy than it is to Disc, but yeah.
Yeah, it was the same thing as like in Sepulcher or whatever. We saw that like we weren't sure exactly what spec they were going to run, but like they ended up just running Holy instead, and like you weren't mad about it because if you wanted to play Disc, you already had geared priests. So yeah.
All right, so that is our A tier is just those 2 specs for this one. But again, it's worth noting that the gaps are fairly small between the healers this time around. We're drawing some light distinctions, mostly based on, it's less based on like how well they'll perform when they're in the raid, and more based on the fact that we just like, we don't expect to see raids without these specs, and we do expect to sometimes see raids choose to not play the specs that we're going to place down in B sometimes.
It seems like way less stacky, at least from my experience, than previous tiers where you have like, I mean, there was old year where people ran 3 Disc priests and that was like a good comp.
Yeah. Rainbow comp is BIS.
All right. Resto Druid is the first spec in B tier. All right, Theun, what makes this spec really, really strong as a throughput healer?
So they have really frequent cooldown usage. So they have like Convoke, Tranquility, Flourish, all on relatively short cooldowns, well, except for Tranquility. And all of those are really impactful cooldowns, notably. So like compare that to like Resto Shaman, who like they also have a large amount of cooldowns, but Resto Druid's cooldowns are just more potent. And then similar to Disc Priest, they're like a ramp healer. So you're like combining Convoke and Flourish or something, or like Flourish and Tranquility for these massive peaks in healing. The one benefit that they have over Disc Priest is they do much better healing like between their ramps. So they have like a lot of hot healing and stuff, and their tree has a lot of like wild growth benefits as well. So they're a little bit better like between the ramps than Disc Priest is, but I think Disc Priest has like higher peaks.
So what stops you from bringing a second disc in the place of a Resto Druid? Is it just that sustained healing in between those ramps?
Yeah, they have like a little bit different healing profiles. Resto Druid, I think, is a little bit better on mana. The main difference between the two, in my opinion, is like Druid does not have barrier, which is notable.
Yeah.
And then Druid also does less passive damage than Disc Priest does, although they're still like quite good. Like Nature's Vigil can do quite a lot, so it's not like they're bad at passive damage anymore, like they have been, but I think Disc is like, that's where Disc edges out Resto Druid, I think.
I feel about Mark of the Wild Dratnos. Are these your Mark of the Wild carriers?
Well, that's the thing, right? Mark of the Wild is really strong, but you probably have, you know, a Boomkin in your radar already. So the Mark of the Wild that you're bringing it's a little bit less likely to be your first copy than the Holy Paladin, right? Who might well be your only Paladin in the raid.
Mm-hmm.
All right, up next in our B tier, we have the Holy Priest, which, again, a lot of the nice thing about this is that you kind of get to gear one for free when you're gearing your Disc Priest, right? So, or if you play 2 Priests as well, you can get away with that because if you need to, you can have them both play Disc, you can have them both play Holy if the fight calls for it. When would Holy be a competitive or potentially even better choice than Disc? Like, what sort of fights would that be? Would that be true?
So if you want a second priest, like if you wanted like a second PI or something like that, priest still does like okay damage. But if one thing that you like struggle with if you're like planning out your healing cooldowns is like Disc wants to ramp on like 1 minute and 30 timers, and you don't want to make them wait like 2 minutes and 30 between the ramps. And if that's the case, then Holy is probably going to be the better play for like your second priest. So you can have like one priest cover the really large spiky damage with Disc, and then the Holy Priest could like fill in elsewhere with like him and salvation and stuff like that. And then they're also quite a bit better on mana as well, at the expense of like they don't have barrier, although Symbols is also quite strong, very defensive, but they do a little bit less passive damage than Disc does. So
I do think that it like gives pretty decent on-demand healing, and it's like a really solid healer for like your third or fourth healer slot, which is, I mean, why it's in B as opposed to A.
Right.
I mean, at the same point, there are like a decent amount of spread fights, like Broodkeeper, like Dathia, you know, like Primal Council, where Holy also starts to fall behind a little bit, right? Because they want you to be stacked up a little bit more, as opposed to like Resto Druid, right? Which doesn't care.
Also, one like benefit to Holy Priest is like, unlike Disc, where barrier is like you need to stack inside of it, if there are spread fights, then like Symbols is actually a really good like raid wide DR, I guess. You can kind of use it that way. You saw that on like Rygalon and stuff where people are kind of spread out and like doing different duties and stuff. And you can use Symbol as a pseudo like raid DR that's like raid wide, kind of like or Mastery or Rally from a Warrior or something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it kind of relies on the raid to be actually pressing their defensives. But again, this tier list is aimed at the levels of play where that is happening, and not at the lower levels where, you know, reducing a Boomkin's Barkskin cooldown isn't going to change anything when that's never getting pressed.
That's like saying Divine Hymn is a bad cooldown because your healers may not use their healing cooldowns.
I do think it's a little different. Like I think with Symbol of Hope, like there's legitimately a huge gap in how much value like World Top 100 versus World Top 1000 guilds are getting out of it.
Yeah, I have a massive weak aura.
Yeah, I mean, if you like having a weak aura for everybody in your guild is if you're using a Holy Priest in an encounter, giving everybody a weak aura that air horns them to press their, especially the Moonkins with Barkskin, but there are some other classes as well that should basically just press it whenever the Holy Priest presses Symbol.
Yeah.
Okay. Next B tier spec that we have here is the Mistweaver Monk, which I've kind of been thinking about this. I could see this going kind of either way. Like I've seen some solid copium about Mistweaver, like throughput and the value of stuff like the Generous Pour and the AoE healing taken increase. So the AoE avoidance, the AoE healing taken increase in a 10-yard circle around you that might make this actually quite desirable. But also it is Mistweaver, and historically that hasn't broken into high-end rating, right?
We always overrate this spec every single tier, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's way better off than it was in Shadowlands. It does a lot of like passive damage now, almost competitive with like Disc Priest before you include PI, of course. The downside is it still doesn't have like impactful raid cooldowns. So like if you're assigning raid cooldowns and stuff, like Yu'lon can be really good. It is a lot of throughput, but it's not like something that's going to like take you over the edge, kind of like a Druid or a Disc Priest will. Similarly, like Revival isn't great. It's down there with like Healing Tide. It's like probably one of the worst healing cooldowns, unless you need like a spread out raid mass dispel or whatever. You can use like that as well. But
even then they often make the mechanics that you might want that to dispel not actually get dispelled, right? Because like you might not want to dispel them.
Yeah. So there's a couple of uses I think for it. It does really good damage now, like I said. So that's a big benefit that it has going for it, and it does really good throughput. So I think it's like probably filling your like fourth healer or fifth healer, probably in a raid, rather than like being your like first or second pick, for example.
The problem is that it doesn't really fill an identifiable niche that needs filling. Like, yeah, sustained healing is not bad, but you would rather just have like 1.5 minute disc ramps to be able to like fill damage situations, because they normally only happen like once every 45 seconds or once every minute or something like that. And so like you don't mind to have pretty powerful defensive cooldowns like that.
Yeah, I think Mistweaver and like Preservation Evoker and Holy Priest to some extent kind of fill the same niche of like they're a throughput healer. Their cooldowns aren't quite as impactful as like a Resto Druid, so they're a little bit below that in my opinion.
I could unironically see this being taken to every single Race World first kill, though. If guilds have decided that this is where they're getting their Mystic Touch from, it kind of depends. At least in my thoughts, is like depends on the value of Windwalker Monk. I could see you taking a Mistweaver to every single fight just to get your Mystic Touch from that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best thing it has going for it for the World First guilds is it has Mystic Touch. So it's whether or not you're playing Windwalker, like you said.
Their mana also kind of sucks, right? And Disc it wants to eat your innervates.
Yeah, they prefer an innervate. I think they can build around it, but they're not like super happy about it.
Yeah.
All right, now the very slightly different teal class, the Evoker, is going to enter our tier list here at the B tier as well. Preservation's been one, I think, since announced, people have been like, I think that one of the big narratives was worry about the range. The range did get slightly buffed. There are still some fights where that is a legitimate worry for me, at least. But in terms of healing number, this spec has actually been kind of cranking in that department, right?
So it's like they're overtuned, but they're only overtuned on stacked healing, right?
Yeah, so I think like if you looked back at season 3, like Resto Druid was like 20% ahead of the rest of the raid, and I think that's currently Evoker. Like they're way overtuned in my opinion. And if range is not an issue, this spec owns. It also does like a lot of good. It does good passive damage as well. The downside is it doesn't really bring anything like super unique. Like the raid buff is like it's okay, but like you can go without it, and you're not mad about it. But it does a ton of just like constant healing. So kind of like Mistweaver and Holy Priest, like this spec just like slams healing constantly. Also has some pretty good cooldowns. Rewind is like really good, especially if you use it well, like right after damage events. And then Dream Flight as well, the one that like you just kind of fly across the raid. That one is also like really overpowered in my opinion.
It's just so weird because there are 3 fights in my opinion: Dathia, Broodkeeper, and Primal Council that keeps players spread fairly far from one another, though, right? Which is going to be to the detriment of Preservation.
Yeah, I heard after the Dathia test, that's the one that you get like knocked back and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, I heard a lot of complaints about Preservation on that fight. That's kind of like your laundress of this tier, where I don't know, you'll probably sit it on something like that. But if the range is not an issue and you're able to stack up fairly well, I think the spec's really good. And I think it's designed really well, which is nice.
We started out with 2 on Primal Council during testing and immediately logged off the 2 after we saw like 3 pulls in. We're like, okay, this is not happening.
All right, finally, we have the Restoration Shaman coming in the C tier.
Yeah.
Why we got this one down so low?
So like I'm a Resto Shaman main, so I'm a little biased here, but it does the lowest throughput. So even on fights that you were like super stacked up on, Grim Totem, for example, it was like the perfect fight for a Resto Shaman. You're all stacked up. It's constant raid damage, and you're cycling through your cooldowns often. It's still not even top 3 on that fight. It does the worst passive damage. I mean, it has essentially no passive damage at all, aside from like Flame Shock. So all of the damage that you're providing is at the detriment of your healing. And the cooldowns that it has, so Spirit Link is like really good, but it's like kind of niche. Like the last real big use for it was on Stone Legion General's Prog, which is a long time ago. There's a couple of cases where I think it could be pretty good in this tier, but I think that's its use case. Is if you want a shaman, then you're probably making use of like Spirit Link Totem or Ankh Totem. And if not, then a lot of the utility is brought by other healers. It was the only healer with a kick, and now that's no longer true.
Yeah.
Windrush Totem also got nerfed. It's now 40%, unlike Druid's 60% roar. So that's also worse. So I don't think it really has like a reason to bring it. I think the DPS specs of Shaman were also struggling in that department, except for like Wind Fairy Totem. But yeah, it doesn't really have that like reason to like, why should we bring a Shaman? So
how much do you think they're like real world throughput in this 40% like thing, assuming that like if player health bars are often not topped, is their mastery going to find some extra value, maybe make them actually overperform a little bit in raid, or is that too much copium?
It didn't seem like it. We only had the one raid test of like, I think it was Grim Totem and Council.
Yeah.
But there wasn't really a difference that I could see from there. The downside is like Preservation's Mastery is just Resto Shaman's Mastery, but like better. So I don't think it's quite there. I think it could use a little bit of a buff in the healing department, and like damage is like a tricky one, but I think the damage is like fine. I think it could use a healing buff, and it would be more than fine to play.
It's just weird because like you talk about Disc Priest or something like that, and like all of their damage comes from like Penance, right? And Purchase the Wicked Dot, and so it's like that. Those are two completely passive things. Whereas some of these other specs, not necessarily that Resto Shaman is like this, but you need to cast a lot of damage levels to even get close to Penance and Purge.
Yeah, it's rough. So
what do you think that like if they buff this spec? Okay, say this spec got like hotfix buffed during the next couple weeks. How high do you think this thing could go? You think this could be up in a B if it just gets like a decent amount of throughput buffed?
Yeah, I think like honestly, it mainly just needs a throughput buff, and like it would be competing for like your 4th healer spot.
Okay.
I don't think there's a reason to like warrant bringing it over like a Holy Paladin or Just Priest ever currently. But yeah, I think so long as its throughput is like at least comparable to like Holy Priest or like Mistweaver or something, then like you can make the argument to bring it. It still brings like Spirit Link, which is good. So
All right, that is all 7 of our healer specs listed. Again, we're kind of predicting a rainbow comp, like multiple different copies of things, maybe 2 priests, maybe 2 paladins, but we're thinking there's a good chance that we'll see a lot of different healers in progression for top end teams. So we'll see how this ended up being. Thanks so much for helping us make this list, Theun. Much appreciated.
Where can people check out this article, Dratnos?
Oh yeah, that's on Wowhead. It's the Wowhead tier list as well. We will update it there too. So go back, and if you check there, the link in the description and stuff, you can go see what's changed based on tuning changes, if buffs or nerfs come in, and also just as we learn if any of this was really wrong about any of these specs.